Welcome. My name is Laura Van Penen, and I am a board member of BigTentUSA. At Big Tent, we are steadfast in our commitment to defending our democratic values, the Constitution, and the rule of law. Our goal is to empower you with the facts, guidance, and calls to action so that you can become a stronger, more effective advocate. To that end, we have a lot of great calls to action on our Act Now page. That's going to pop up in the chat. There's a link. If you click on that, you can review the calls to action that we suggest. We're going to high spot one call to action tonight that has particular urgency. Think about becoming a sustaining member of your local NPR and/or PBS station. We've got a lot of geographies represented this evening, so your NPR affiliate might be WNYC, WBUR, KQED, WBEZ, whatever it might be. We just urge you to support independent journalists whose voices are so vitally important right now. And in that vein, you might have heard our opening theme music. That is REM's brand new re-release of Radio Free Europe. If you download their song, those proceeds will go to Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. And now I'd like to introduce you to our distinguished guests. Ed Luce is currently the U.S. National Editor and Columnist at the Financial Times. At the FT, Ed has also served as the Washington Bureau Chief, the South Asia Bureau Chief, Capital Markets Editor, and Philippines Correspondent. He appears regularly, you've probably seen him, on CNN, NPR, MSNBC's Morning Joe, and the BBC. Prior to Ed's time at the FT, he was the speechwriter for the U.S. Treasury Secretary, Lawrence Summers, in the Clinton administration. Ed has authored many books. His latest, which will be out next week and will be discussed tonight, is a biography of Zbig Brzezinski. The name of the book, Zbig, The Life of Zbig Brzezinski, America's Great Power Prophet. Charlie Sykes is the author of the Substack newsletter To the Contrary. He is a familiar face on MSNBC, and he contributes regularly to a wide range of national publications, including The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, Politico, and many others. Charlie has also produced a number of books, including, in 2017, How the Right Lost Its Mind. With that, I'll turn things over to Ed and Charlie. Welcome to Big Tent.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. We're going to cover a lot of ground tonight, including Ed's new book and the extraordinary moment that we find ourselves in. You know, Ed, as I was reading your book about the Carter era and thinking through the transformation of American politics and the transformation of America's place in the world, you know, it is a surreal experience, including the fact that, did you ever think that you would see the president of the United States, a Republican president of the United States, basically channeling his inner neo-Marxist soul in talking about how maybe kids only need 2 dolls or a couple of pencils, 5 pencils. I think the central planners decided that 5 pencils would be enough. And on my Substack, I actually kind of morphed together Donald Trump with Joseph Stalin. So just talk to me about this weird moment in which we have gone from the Cold War to having a president of the United States who just does seem to channel much of the rhetoric of Vladimir Putin and of an ideology that would have been completely alien to Republicans of the 70s, 80s, and long before that.
Well, first of all, Charlie, thanks so much for hosting this, and to BigTentUSA and to Laura and to Kitty. Wonderful to be on this. Good question, Charlie. I mean, your Substack today, I think, nailed the Alice in Wonderland weirdness of having a Republican president, Donald Trump, talk like a central planner, like Gosplan of the Soviet era. That you only need a certain amount of dolls. You only need a certain, I mean, 5, something with not 7, not 4, 5. That was the number he determined, as opposed to 250. Very precise, which is exactly what central planners are. And, you know, I'm not the sort of, Hayekian free market type. I do believe in the free market where it works and the state where it doesn't, and a pragmatic public-private mixture, where merited. But, Reagan had a coherent philosophy that on some measures worked. Donald Trump is picking. And I'm not entirely sure why, other than this is the only excuse that comes to mind for a trade war, a Liberation Day trade war that makes no sense in practice. This is his rationale. He's just sort of plucking things because he knows the shelves will be empty. He knows there will be less choice. He knows that what choice people will still have if this tariff war is put into full effect will be a fraction of the choice people did have last week. And this is imminent, by the way. We're talking later this month. If you look at the container terminal traffic from China and elsewhere, and the Los Angeles Port Authority data, well, you've got 180 degrees from Reagan. That's quite something. But you nailed it in your Substack this morning.
Well, I mean, perhaps this is one of those things that you should, not take too seriously. I mean, Donald Trump has many, many distractions. He watches a lot of television. Apparently, he was watching a movie about Alcatraz and decided that what America needed to become great again was reopening Alcatraz. But also, we talk about the long arc of American leadership in the world, and I want to get into that in more detail. If you go back through the 100 days, there were so many shocking things in that campaign of shock and awful. Probably the most dramatic and maybe one of the most long-term will be the way in which Donald Trump seemed to change sides in the Cold War, that moment when he voted with Russia in the United Nations, his abandonment of Ukraine. It strikes me as a complete break from the bipartisan foreign policy that, I mean, there were significant differences, obviously, we go through them, but there was a consensus about the role that America played in the world, its relationship to its allies in NATO, that has now been broken, and it feels like a clean break. What do you think?
It does feel like a clean break, and I think there's no sort of better measure of that than the fact that, Germany has changed its constitution, which is not easy. It requires two-thirds of both chambers in their constitution to change the constitution in order to break their debt limit, their post-war debt limit that's there for good historical reasons, and spend a lot of money on defense. Now, I'm quite glad they're doing that anyway. But they are sufficiently panicked, and the Germans are sufficiently conservative with a small c, and hesitant and cautious that this is the biggest sign that Trump has just changed the entire view of the world, of America's role in it. And, a couple of others, and this might, I think, sort of qualify as pretty good news in this pretty dark environment that we're living in, which is Canada's election last week. Mark Carney's Liberal Party romping back home, having a few weeks before been predicted for a landslide defeat, and the previous year heading for a landslide. Only Trump could do that. And then,
and
yes,
Australia.
And then, yes, Tony Albanese's Labour Party romping home against a MAGA candidate who had make Australia great again as his baseball cap there. So, I mean, that to me is the best measure of them all.
So we've also seen this dramatic shift domestically, the role of the president, his relationship to the rule of law. And you wrote something, and you and I talked about it at the time, a couple of weeks ago. You wrote, at around noon on April 14th, 2025, America ceased to have a law-abiding government. Some would argue that it already happened on January 20th when Donald Trump was inaugurated. On Monday, however, Trump chose to ignore a 9-0 Supreme Court ruling to repatriate an illegally deported man. He even claimed the judges ruled in his favor. The U.S. president's middle finger to the court was echoed by his Attorney General, Secretary of State, Vice President, and El Salvador's vigilante president, Bukele. The latter is playing host to what resembles an embryonic U.S. gulag. Tough stuff. Do you still think that we are halfway to being a police state, Ed?
So, I mean, halfway is more a rhetorical device. I don't know precisely how you measure it, but the fact that the President of the United States would openly side on live TV, one of these sort of open Oval Office meetings, this time with Bukele, El Salvador's strongman, that he would openly side with him over America's 9-0. Remember, 9-0 means Clarence Thomas voted to repatriate,
Sam Alito.
and Sam Alito. They voted to repatriate Abrego Garcia. And the word facilitate, I mean, does mean make happen. And so the idea that we're playing semantics here, that they didn't really order Trump and he doesn't really know, and ask my lawyers, I only work here, you know, in the same breath almost as saying Biden was just an auto signature, that he only works here. I mean, that's a pretty big moment. I don't know whether it's halfway towards a police state or a quarter way, but to rebuke the Supreme Court over a test case that could affect millions of people, citizens included, strikes me as a pretty bad indicator. But Charlie, you're steeped in this stuff. What's your take?
Well, I mean, and it was also that that little sidebar where he's joking that he would like to send homegrown criminals, by which he obviously was meaning American citizens, and the laughter in the room from all of the cabinet members, like this was a big joke. Now, since then, several things have happened. Donald Trump has admitted that, of course, he could facilitate Abrego Garcia's return. He could just pick up a phone call. He admitted that, and if there's any question that he's defying the U.S. Supreme Court, Abrego Garcia is still in El Salvador. I mean, this was a binary choice. He would either come back or he would stay there, and he's still there. So the defiance of the U.S. Supreme Court by the president is right there in front of us. And I guess that's part of the story, isn't it? You know, how much of this is taking place in broad daylight? The corruption, the grifting, the use of crypto to buy influence, the foreign deals. All of them feel like some sort of dark matter, erasing all of the things that happened in the 1970s post Watergate. All of those reforms, all of those guardrails that we thought were there are now being erased.
Yeah, I mean, Trump talks of foreign powers, even the biggest like China, as if they will simply submit, that we've got the leverage and we'll make them submit until we get to Bukele, where suddenly he respects the sovereignty of El Salvador. But I appreciate you were giving me a very charitable segue onto my book, Zbig, which was short for Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was Henry Kissinger's sort of great frenemy, if you like, Cold War rival, as sort of grand strategists in the American firmament. And of course, Henry Kissinger was, national security advisor and Secretary of State to Nixon, then Gerald Ford. And Brzezinski was to Jimmy Carter. And my biography, which I have to say, I've spent 5 years on this. And I never imagined that the week before it came out, which is next Tuesday, there would be such a good news hook, which is Trump firing or allegedly promoting Mike Waltz as national security advisor to become UN ambassador. I take that as a firing because the UN doesn't feature in Trump's sort of catalogue of seriousness. But yes, in those days, regardless of what the differences were, and there were huge differences between Kissinger and Brzezinski. I mean, this was a legendary rivalry, and they were sort of friends as well. It was a complicated relationship, but there was some truth to the phrase then that politics stops at the water's edge. There were bipartisan stances on the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, for example, or its invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. There was a clear sort of American sense of unity when it came to really big questions. That's vanished in the last 110 days, whatever it is, 107 days. That's vanished. I hope it will come back, but right now it's vanished.
Well, what's really interesting reading your account and thinking through is that in many ways, Zbig was more of a cold warrior than Kissinger, in the sense that he had He had no illusions about Russia. He had a very, very clear, realistic view of them. The Russians loathed him. And so just remember that this was, and I think it's also just fascinating to remember that Jimmy Carter named him as his national security advisor just a few years after the Democrats had nominated George McGovern. So this was a time when the Democrats at least had people in place who had a very, very hard line on Russia. And again, no illusions whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating looking at Kissinger and Brzezinski's lives. I mean, these were sort of a measure of extraordinary dynamism and openness of America during the Cold War, that two immigrants, one then known as Heinz Kissinger, crossed the Atlantic in 1938. Both crossed in the same year. Kissinger was 15,
Hmm.
fleeing an oncoming Holocaust that would consume most of his extended family, and the other, Zbig Brzezinski, whose dad was a Polish diplomat, knew exactly what was coming. I mean, they set sail across the Atlantic 2 days after the Munich agreement was struck. And so he got himself posted to North America, to Montreal, as it happens. But that they both arrived within weeks of each other and then reached the top of their fields. Kissinger first, and then Brzezinski, in a field that when they arrived was dominated by, basically the WASP elites,
Hmm.
the Georgetown set, the wise men, um, with extraordinary different perceptions, though, of the Cold War. Kissinger wanted stability, and he basically, with Nixon, initiated détente, relaxation,
Hmm.
um, literally, of US Soviet rivalry. And by the time Carter was elected, and Kissinger was still Secretary of State then to Ford.
Yeah.
By the time Carter was elected, the Soviets were again sort of promoting revolution around the world, in the Horn of Africa, in Angola. I mean, there were all sorts of Soviet sponsorships going on. And Carter represented a shift to the right, funnily enough.
Yeah.
They ended détente. So this Brzezinski, I think, saw the world through Polish eyes, and he became very much an American, and he declared himself insanely proud to be American. But remember, his homeland was razed more than any other. Warsaw was the most destroyed capital city in the Second World War, and that was his home, where he was raised, where his family and friends and others lived. And so that burned itself on him and his understanding, and this is too long an answer. I promise you, I'm about to bring
No,
it
no.
in, Charlie. His understanding was that the Achilles heel, as he called it, of the Soviet Empire was the nationalities. That
Hmm.
they didn't like being under a Russian, not a Soviet, a Russian yoke. And if we could kindle Ukraine, Poland, etc., we could bring
Hmm.
this Russian empire to an end. And I think he was broadly correct on that question.
As you're talking, I was thinking of the question I was going to ask you, which was, why this book about this man at this particular moment in history? And it does strike me, your subtitle is that the life of Zbigniew Brzezinski, America's great power prophet, that this is coming at a time when a lot of those things are being unraveled. Those alliances are being destroyed. America first has become America alone. And Zbig and others worked very assiduously to build up those relationships, understanding the importance of those nationalities, like the Poles, like the Estonians, the Lithuanians, the Ukrainians. And right now, we have an administration that is turning away from them, that is not crafting those kinds of relationships. And so, in many ways, it's a bookend. I was having a conversation with Julian Zelizer from Princeton the other day, and confess he's the historian. I'm sort of the geek, and saying, one of the books that I read recently was Dean Acheson's book, Present at the Creation, one of the predecessors, and realize how contingent it all was. We took it for granted for 70 or 80 years, these great power alliances, and yet it was a near run thing. And it was a near run thing when Jimmy Carter was the president and Ronald Reagan was the president. Things could have gone in a very, very different way. You actually wrote a piece for the New York Times, "The Dinner That Helped Save Europe." Okay, so talk to me about that. This is the dinner with Carter and Zbig and Pope John Paul II. How did it save Europe?
So that's a brilliant question. I mean, I have to say one thing: the sort of what Kissinger and Brzezinski had in common, and I think this is to do with their common stories of emigration, that they were fleeing the interwar bloodlands of Central Europe,
Hmm.
is the idea of the fragility of things,
Yes.
that societies can break down, that tragedy is always possible. I mean, in a way, it's a sort of more pessimistic European version of the price of Benjamin Franklin, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. Um, and um, and so they did bring that, and I think maybe we're having to relearn this lesson now. I hope we're not going to have to relearn it too well. But the dinner that helped save Europe was after the Pope John Paul II had been elected in the conclave, which is a term we're getting refamiliar with today, in the Vatican, and he happened to be the first non-Italian pope in 450 years, which was a striking coincidence since
Yeah.
the United States had its first ever Polish-speaking national, and so far the last national security advisor. And Pope John Paul II was, of course, from Poland. And so when the Soviets amassed, and these two men struck up a relationship in Polish, they already knew each other. Brzezinski had P for Pope on his White House phone, so he had a Vatican hotline that he used a
Mm.
lot. And when the Soviets amassed on the Polish border 16 divisions, which is
Yeah.
a lot of troops, in late 1980, after Reagan had won, by the way, during the
Right.
transition,
Yeah.
when Solidarity, Lech Walensa's movement had sort of sprung up, they wanted to crush it. The Pope and Brzezinski um, together devised ways of persuading Moscow, persuading Brezhnev, the Soviet leader, that Poland would be indigestible. It would be a porcupine. And that is kind of the strategy today of non-Trumpians for
Hmm.
Putin and Ukraine. Really? You think you can swallow Ukraine? I wouldn't try eating that if I were you.
No, I mean the history of the West would be very different. Had Russia invaded Poland in 1980 and crushed that revolution. So those personal relationships mattered. So let's just talk about right now our relationship with Russia. And again, among the many things that I never thought that I would see, certainly from the 1980s, is watching a United States president who not only himself seems to be mimicking much of the rhetoric of the Kremlin, but he has surrounded himself with people who are, I guess the nicest thing I could say is susceptible to Vladimir Putin's propaganda. I mean, this is an extraordinary moment for those of us that really thought we understood what America's role in the world is. And I guess the question, well, big question, the really big question is how do we get it back? I mean, it's one thing to elect Donald Trump once, and I think David Frum has the analogy that it's a little bit like mixing. What is it? What did he say? It was tequila with some hard drug, and people could say, okay, that was a one-time thing, but now we've done it twice. What's it going to take to get America back to being a trusted leader, the leader of the free world again?
It's a really good but difficult to answer question, because clearly, if things don't go the worst, if they go less bad in the next, whatever it is, 80 days, I mean, maybe it's less of the 90-day pause Trump has on this declaration
Mhm.
of economic war on the world.
Yeah.
The best case scenario is basically he finds people like the European Union and Canada and Australia and Mexico find face-saving formulas for Trump to pretend he's
Mhm.
got a deal, a sort of kabuki
Right.
deal, and then walk off and declare victory, and then we carry on. But even in that best case scenario, these other countries are not going to trust Trump's signature. They don't believe his word
That's
because
right.
he started this trade war at the beginning of, actually, before he was even inaugurated, on Canada and Mexico. And that was in December, in fact. And what was he doing? He was saying that the deal he got both those countries to negotiate over a year in his first term was a really bad deal. And now we've got to renegotiate it. And you're poisoning us with fentanyl and sort of stuff that is very hard for you to recover trust from if you renegotiated that deal and now you realize it's totally worthless. Trump's word means nothing. And so even if we have the best case scenario of Trump, as I say, walking away with these symbolic bits of paper, there is going to be no trust whilst he is president. And so they're going to be looking for other deals. And the real irony of this situation, which I find deeply frustrating, is that that entities like the European Union, but also today, I mean, ASEAN, the Southeast Asian group of nations, Japan, South Korea, and China signing deals to look about non-dollar, to look at cooperating on non-dollar transactions. All of these countries are with China all of a sudden. That takes real, I won't say skill, because clearly it's the opposite of skill, but that takes for Trump to drive our friends and our enemies together in the space of a month is extraordinary. So it will take time to recover trust in America, because as you say, Charlie, much as all the countries in the world, including adversaries, admire America, but particularly its friends, the fact that Trump has been elected twice is quite worrying.
Okay, let me ask you a really scary question. What are the implications for nuclear proliferation? This was something that every administration had been concerned about, going back going back to Truman and Eisenhower and Kennedy. Much of the rest of the world trusted and relied on America's nuclear umbrella. Now, as they look at America, they're not sure they can trust America. They're not even sure they're on the same side as America. Aren't there tremendous incentives for many countries now to say, we need our own nuclear deterrence? Look what happened to Ukraine. Ukraine gave up its nukes in exchange for all kinds of guarantees. Look where they are. What happens now?
So I'm a little bit less pessimistic than I was about a week ago. We have a bill. I mean, that's a very low bar. I mean, don't get me wrong, and I'd be really interested in your this. But Lindsey Graham is sponsoring a bill that has 72 names so far in the Senate attached, so more than veto proof, to impose secondary sanctions on Russia and on entities from other countries dealing with Russia, which means Trump can't veto it. And I assume Lindsey Graham, being very close to Trump, has somehow managed, at least for the time being, to get Trump to agree to this. And then Zelensky signed this rather silly, but could be harmless minerals deal with the United States. So maybe we're reaching a point where Germany is talking less about going nuclear, and we really don't want Germany, and Germany doesn't want to go nuclear. Maybe we're, less close to Poland, which is capable of going nuclear. But if Trump flips back, as is his wont, to where he was a week or two ago, which he will, because he's, the master of the agent of chaos, then again, this nuclear conversation is there. It's happening anyway, because nobody trusts his word. So it is happening. And those countries are on the top of the list, but South Korea and Japan are in particular on the top of the list. But what's your forecast on this? Is Trump fainting on Putin? Fainting, E-I-N-T-I-N-G? Or what is this a real toughening up that's going on? How do you
No, I would not expect that, man. I would also not put too much weight of optimism on Lindsey Graham's backbone. I think we've kind of seen that that's not something to rely on. I think what's more interesting is how Vladimir Putin is humiliating Donald Trump and has gone out of his way to humiliate him. In the first 100 days, it was interesting how many Americans, American institutions, law firms, universities, and others were so afraid of Donald Trump, felt the need that they had to felt the need to bend the knee and to kiss the ring. And Vladimir Putin, who appears to have, I think, one of the clearest understandings of Donald Trump, says he's the bully. I'm not going to give him what he wants. I'm going to keep him dangling. And now, what is Donald Trump's tolerance for that humiliation? It's pretty extraordinary so far, but clearly he does not. He has not grasped that. And I guess the other. So talking in terms of the international order here, you mentioned before the elections in Canada, the elections in Australia. But one thing that Donald Trump has done is he's created an alliance with many of these far right authoritarian regimes around the world, like Bukali in El Salvador, Viktor Orban in Hungary. Apparently, Romania is about to have some sort of a pro-Putin government. You have studied this and written about this. I think one of the most disturbing things watching Donald Trump is if you followed the authoritarian playbook in places like Hungary, where Viktor Orban went about destroying civil society, the press, an independent press, the universities, you see many of that same playbook being played out, except the difference is that it took Viktor Orban 15 years, and Donald Trump has been trying to do it in a series of in months. But I don't think it's now overstating it to say that Donald Trump is using an authoritarian playbook that is seems to have more relevance to things that have happened in Europe than in American history. Your perspective.
So, I mean, to just get back very briefly to Lindsey Graham, because it is relevant
Yeah.
to your question.
Yeah.
I think this is a feint. I think Trump's trying to pretend to look tough with Putin, but he gave Putin everything Putin wanted. He
Yes.
offered him everything possible. He basically offered him victory, including recognizing, Crimea, the annexation of Crimea. Not entirely clear whether those 4 oblasts, those 4 provinces would be recognized, but de facto they would be. And that Ukraine would never join NATO, etc. And Putin comes back and says, "No, not enough. I want more.
Yeah.
I want you to demilitarize Ukraine." There's a confidence, which is, let's make it a complete sitting duck. So there's a confidence, there's an arrogance, and there's a knowingness, I have to say, to Putin's response to Trump that I think has, in the short term, piqued him into pretending he's going to be tough on him with this Lindsey Graham bill. But I think it's just a trial balloon that will pop. So that's my view. But I mean, I guess reasonable people can disagree, and some people are looking, understandably, particularly across the Atlantic, for pieces of driftwood on which to cling onto. And this might be one of them. But I don't think that I don't think Trump is ever going to have a showdown with Putin. And I think that your point, your observation, Charlie, that Putin has the measure of Trump. I don't think Trump has the measure of Putin. This is asymmetric. And, I have
completely agree.
There is a bit of Brzezinski in my response. And for those people, who are interested in this, I do believe in the Churchill cliche, which is the farther back you can look, the further forward you can see. I do think the history of the Cold War is very relevant in this age we're living in, which is sort of the revenge of geopolitics.
No, I agree completely. Kitty, if you want to come back in with some of the questions from the community, I know that there are a lot of questions in the chat. I haven't been able to keep up with all of them. So if you want to, give us some of those, I would appreciate that.
Yes, of course. You guys, this was so fascinating, and we really appreciate it. I do want to, before we pull some of these questions, I do want you guys to comment on what you see as the relationship between the current corruption that the administration is engaged in and how we need to be thinking about that in terms of geopolitics, in terms of their relationship with other countries, because it does seem to be part and parcel of this, embedded corruption that they have embarked on since day one. So I'm gonna give it to you first, Ed.
Well, Charlie will answer it better, But, it depends which country you're talking about. I think New York Times reported very well today that the Trump children, the sons, Donald Jr. and Eric, are in a sort of fraternal competition to see who can monetize, grift opportunity better between the brothers. So Donald Jr. has been paid to go to Budapest, been paid to go to Sofia in Bulgaria. He's been paid to go to Belgrade, and in each place he's sort of initialing something like a Trump Tower, Trump Hotel, a Trump Resort, and so on to the Gulf. So there are certain countries where the grift, and as we know, the Emirates, UAE, has bought $2 billion worth of coin from World Liberty Financial, which is the Trump crypto vehicle. And Trump, of course, is offering, and I don't think it's debarred to foreigners, the top 220 buyers of the Trump meme coin. The top 220 buyers can join him for dinner later this month with all the access implications that implies. I mean, Charlie can put this far better. And as you know well, Charlie, I could go on and you could go on, but I'd prefer to hear your perspective on this.
No, what's interesting is that shortly before we did this program, I was recording a podcast with Susan Glasser from the New Yorker, and she was talking about your book and comparing your account of the old scandals, the Billy Carter scandals, to what we're seeing now. And what's breathtaking is the scope and the size of the corruption is so out of scale that we're seeing right now, that there was a time when Billygate was something, and now it seems just incredibly trivial. And part of the problem, I think, is there's so much going on that we haven't gotten our heads around how egregious this corruption is, how naked it is, and how unaccountable Donald Trump is. Donald Trump thinks that he got a permanent get out of jail card from the U.S. Supreme Court, and he thinks that no one will call him to account. And he may not be wrong, because what regulatory agency is going to call him on this? But we have never seen the kind of open corruption. Graft and grift don't really capture it. The selling of influence, the selling of access in broad daylight, flagrantly. It's a huge story. And I hope we talk more. I hope everybody in the media and in politics starts talking about it more.
Yeah, I think it's really important. And Anne Applebaum had come to Big Tent earlier this year, and she pointed out that especially in Poland, Ed, back to Zbig, I can't say that right.
Yeah.
That was one of the anti-corruption was one of the themes that really allowed Poland to reclaim a democracy. And so I think it's really important to highlight. So Charlie, you've been doing some good writing about that, but we're going to keep promoting your Substack, and we really appreciate it. So this, I'm going to sort of dart around now because there are some really good questions. There was definitely some questions in the folks who submitted beforehand just about what they should be concerned about financially in their retirement accounts, how they can protect against this uncertainty and this insecurity. And so I'd love to have, Ed, why don't you take us on that path a little bit?
So, I mean, I don't want to say that you should go short on America, because that is advice that, foreigners here. If you're American, you can't really go short on your own country. So the question is more for an American investor, future pensioner, how you hedge against the possibility of disaster here. And as we've seen, everything's been going down. It rallied a little bit recently with the pause, but everything's been going down except gold and crypto. Now, gold is the traditional safe asset in times of war or hyperinflation or revolution. People get gold, or they put money under their mattress, which is not a good idea when there's hyperinflation, by the way. But I wouldn't, I'm not a gold bug. I think there's an element of fetish to that safe asset, even though it will outlast any revolution and any war. So I would suggest diversifying to things like European defense stocks. German defense stocks are really going up because they're going to spend €1 trillion. They've turned a corner. They're going to spend €1 trillion on defense and infrastructure, and the futures markets for Rheinmetall, companies like that are very, efficient manufacturers, and therefore also of weapons. Um, those are surging, those stocks, for a reason. And I hate to say this, I never thought I'd be a hawkish sort of. I'm not an equity analyst. All investment advice should be discounted, except, of course, that my book would be a great Father's Day present, but that's not really. That's not really.
Yes.
That was a cheeky mischief. Disregard. Strike that from the record.
My 91-year-old dad is going to get that for Father's Day. You can count on it. No problem.
But again, I think Charlie's answer will be more interesting. I'd love to hear from Charlie.
I know I never give financial advice, except that circling back to the corruption issue, one of the things that is, I think, the most concerning is the potential for this crony capitalism, insider trading, where the Trump folks know now that they can move the markets, move trillions of dollars by a single tweet or social media post about the tariffs are on, the tariffs are off, and that are clearly whispering to certain people within their circle. That needs to be something to be watched for people in the markets, because if you're not part of that circle, you're just along for the ride. And I think that right now we're in for a period of tremendous volatility and uncertainty, because it is economy by whim, the whim of one man, which is not the way the founding fathers or the architects of post-war capitalism drew it up.
Kimberly really wanted to know, who really is behind, who's got the power right now, because so much of what's being implemented was in Project 2025. So I'd love to get both of your sense for how that's being enacted, and he seems to be really working off this playbook. I think a majority of his executive orders are actually from Project 2025. So Charlie, why don't you start us off on that?
No, I think that's true. And this is one of the paradoxes of the first 100 days. You have this weird juxtaposition of this very detailed, focused plan that's being implemented by Russ Vought, a name that everybody should know. And we've all been focusing on Elon Musk. Russ Vought is the guy who's got the plan, who's got the agenda, and is a pretty smart guy. He's figured out what all the buttons and the levers are, and he's going ahead with it. So on that, you have that on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have the incredible clown car of Fox News hosts who have populated the administration. So you have, on the one hand, you have some guys who have a very, very clear idea of what they want to do. They wrote it down. They published it. The problem that the administration is having, though, is the incompetence and the unqualification of many of the people that they put in place to implement that, which then creates the chaos. But don't underestimate that. And going back to 2020, the Project 2025, I remember, because I live in Wisconsin, we were inundated with Trumpist emails, and mailers saying Donald Trump has nothing to do with Project 2025. He doesn't even know what it is. He's repudiated it. That was one of the many, but it was one of the more significant lies of the 2024 campaign, because that was the blueprint, and you're seeing that being implemented.
Yeah, I mean, if you'd asked, not even a year ago, 8 months ago, if you'd been asked whether Elon Musk would have been playing this central co-presidential role in the first 100 days, that was the one thing you wouldn't have expected.
No,
and
not at all.
That's already on the way out. That's going. I mean, Doge is basically a failure. Musk said we're going to cut 2 trillion. The 150 billion that he's come up with on this notorious wall of receipts, nobody takes seriously, including a Republican-controlled Congress. But the courts don't take seriously. And Musk, is basically on the way out. And he gave an exit interview to Lara Trump, the daughter-in-law of the president. I won't say a hard-hitting exit interview. I'd say soft hitting. Let's call it soft hitting. In which he complained of having been persecuted, etc., for having given Nazi-seeming salutes that people interpreted as Nazi-seeming salutes. I mean, go figure. But he is on the way out. Doge has failed, and Russell Vought, as Charlie said, is back in the driving seat. We would have predicted he was going to be in 8 months ago. So that's Project 2025. And I suspect, Doge will be wrapped under votes de facto control. And we're going to see a slightly more systematic, less incompetent, less Silicon Valley approach to how government bureaucracy in reality can be terrorized. And I think Vote is very good at that. And I think the real tragedy of this, with both Doge and Vote's OMB, the real tragedy is that it's the probationary civil servants. It's the future who's being fired. It's the people who've been invested in, have had training that has cost the taxpayer money. People in aviation safety, people in nuclear safety, people across tons of invisible things that we only value when they're gone, like good health. Those are the ones who are out the door. It's the future that's being fired. And that's a commonality between Musk and Vote.
So how do we get that story across? Because it's not here and now, but it is the very soon to be future. And I know, Charlie, that's what you're trying to do with your Substack. So what are we seeing in terms of that storytelling that you think is resonating, and how do we, all the Americans who are on this call, some are coming in from London, like how do we get those stories out there?
Okay, well, you put your finger on it, because the key is telling those stories. Okay, we've done the emotional ranting and raving, and certainly I've participated in that. But I think that going forward, the downstream impacts of many of those decisions are being felt in every state, every community, in every family. And when you put a human face on the implications, people react in a very, very different way. I think one of the big surprises of the last couple of months was all the smart kids said Democrats and others should not be talking about Abrego Garcia because this is Donald Trump's sweet spot in immigration. But then the polls came out showing that when people were asked about his handling of it, it was one of Donald Trump's worst issues. He was way underwater, which means that when people focus on specific impacts, they might surprise you. And I think the stories are very, very compelling. It's one thing to discuss immigration in the abstract. When you start talking about 3- and 4-year-old children being deported, children with cancer being separated from their parents or being separated from their doctors, people have a different impact. Also, these budget cuts are being felt everywhere. And so I think part of it is that if you know someone who has a story, encourage them to tell that story. And there are so many ways of getting that out. You never know. Somebody can now produce a YouTube video talking about the impact on their community, or the impact on a family member, or the impact on somebody who is vulnerable. And maybe nobody will see it. Maybe 1 million people will see it. But it is the storytelling that I think is the greatest opportunity and the obligation. So you all can be storytellers. You can also encourage others to be storytellers.
And can I strongly underline what Charlie has just said? I mean, and to relate it back to, where we began with Charlie's great Substack posting this morning. Stalin said that 1 death is a tragedy, 1 million deaths is a
Exactly.
And Abrego Garcia is one tragedy. Everybody can relate to it, including people in Iowa who voted for Trump, because this guy was clearly somebody who had kids, he had an American wife, and one kid, but another on the way.
Yeah.
And, worked a daily job, was clearly somebody you could relate to. Whereas, a gang of 300, alleged gang of 300, far more difficult. That becomes numbers. So tell the story.
That's so true. Charlie, I want to go back to you because we did have a really great outcome in your Supreme Court race in Wisconsin. A lot of money was spent on both sides. Oh my God. But I would really love to hear what it was like to be in Wisconsin for that and what you think actually worked.
Well, it was overwhelming. I mean, we are not New York or California or Florida. So to spend $100 million in this state, you could not look anywhere without seeing it. And it's for one seat on the state Supreme Court, which is an indication of, again, how America's lost its mind and lost its perspective. But it really did become a referendum on Donald Trump, and it became a referendum on Elon Musk. This is a very, very closely divided state on a razor's edge. And yet, the more liberal candidate won easily. It was a complete repudiation of Trumpist politics. And what was interesting was that the conservatives, the Republicans, hit all their voter mark. They got their voters out. But Democrats did a better job. They had a much better turnout. So if there was any concern that anti-Trump voters were depressed or demoralized or were disengaged, Wisconsin, I think, was an example of the fact that no, they're locked in and they are willing to come out in extraordinary numbers. I also think that as you look back on it, the Wisconsin result was sort of the beginning of the end for Elon Musk's bromance with Donald Trump. That he was, Trump, saw the repudiation, and from that moment, um, Elon Musk, as the kingmaker and enforcer for MAGA, was in decline.
You both, there's a lot of great conversations. People are talking about a protest that's going to be taking place in June. We have a very fired up community. But I do want to just wrap with this question to both of you, because you both encounter, I think, more people in your life who maybe voted for Trump twice, or at least recently, around, the economy and their finances and their taxes. And so and Charlie in particular, being a former Republican, I'd love to get you both to sort of tell us the conversations that you're having, maybe a couple things that you feel are convincing people in your world to start to think about why we all need to stand strong against the authoritarian in the White House. So, Charlie, why don't you start us off, and Ed, I'll let you close us out.
Well, I think that this is one of those moments where, in the first, 100 days, I think people were shocked and were back on their heels. But this is one of those clarifying moments. People have to decide, what does it mean to be an American? What are American values? What actually is important? I'm encouraged that people actually do care about things like due process. They do care about, whether or not people are treated in a cruel and brutal way. I do think that this, we're going to come out of this changed as a country, one way or another. And I don't know how it's going to be, but I do think that this is one of the moments where we need to rethink, in a very serious way, things that we took for granted. I think that there was a certain complacency among Americans, that we thought that we were immune to history, that we've seen history, that republics fail, democracies, fall apart, and that somehow that wouldn't happen here. It could not happen here. And now we're thinking, you know what? It can happen here. Maybe it is happening here right now. So my one negative comment is that people need to remember something about politics. Politics is not a referendum. It's not whether you are for or against somebody. It is a binary choice. It is a choice between two things. So we do need to have a discussion about, what are Democrats going to do? How do they reestablish their relationship with voters who have been alienated? Because no matter how awful MAGA or Donald Trump is, unless the Democrats can persuade voters that they share the values, we're going to see a continuation of the process. I mean, Democrats have lost to this man, this deplorable orange God King. They've lost 2 out of 3 elections. And I know that there are a lot of people who are very impatient. Don't talk about Democrats. Don't bash Democrats. This is not a time for any sort of introspection. It is absolutely a time for introspection, because unless the Democrats can figure out how to effectively counter Donald Trump, even a failed authoritarian Donald Trump will be formidable, and his successors will be formidable. So this is something, and we could go into more detail, but I don't want to be divisive. But there are certain people who I would say are not the future of the Democratic Party, and there should not be any delusions about all of that. So I'll throw it to Ed to have a much more eloquent response.
Our friend Steve Messenger just said, "Amen, Charlie."
Okay.
It
All
is
right,
one of
Ed.
Is one of those the governor of California, Charlie, or am I just spitballing here?
Yeah,
Sorry, I'm being mischievous again. Look, I don't tend to think, as the previous sort of question you asked, Kitty, that you relayed, and I think Charlie and I agreed in our agreeing on most things, um, conveyed with the Abrego Garcia sympathy that he's engendered around the nation. I don't feel much temptation as a foreigner who's been here a long time and who travels a lot. I don't feel much temptation to just write off America as, or half of America, as morally beyond the pale. And I think that's a terrible strategy. Um,
Yep.
but I think you can address those Americans who've changed their mind with the Abrego Garcia example. You can address those Americans whilst holding another American saying in your head, which is that you hate the sin, not the sinner. And I think
Mhm.
the less personal and vituperative and accusatorial this is about those who voted for Trump, and this sense of New Testament forgiveness I have does not apply to those who are executing his agenda. Don't get me wrong. Elon Musk is a reprehensible human being. So don't get me wrong, as is Donald Trump. But is to be very, very pragmatic about speaking to people, including low information voters, in ways that will break through to them. And I've got some confidence that could work. I'm not predicting it will, but I've got some confidence it could work. But it has to happen now. It has to happen now.
Can I have one
Okay.
last comment here? One
Yes.
last comment is
Go,
also,
Charlie.
no, is support the people who do the right thing. And I feel guilty about that sometimes, that I spend most of my time criticizing the bad actors, and I think we think in terms of how do we put pressure on them. But also I think it's important to change the opportunity cost for people who might show courage and do the right thing. So support the law firms that stand up, support the companies that stand up, support the media outlets that stand up. This may be controversial for some of the audience, but I actually felt bad this morning, and I've been feeling bad about it all day, that I didn't write something about the award that Mike Pence got for courage from the JFK Foundation, because I see a lot of people on the left saying, oh, he wasn't brave, he didn't deserve any sort of credit. Wait, if right now we are asking people, show courage, stand up. You cannot at the same time say, we want you to show courage, but if you do, you will get no support or love from us. You can't do that. We need to create incentives. If you want a big tent, you need to make that big tent welcoming, and you need to have the flaps wide open. So, again, criticize the bad actors, but make sure that the people who do the right thing, no matter what background they have, no matter what purity tests they failed in the past, you got to bring them in right now. You got to change the formula of risk and reward. That was my
I
last one.
couldn't, no, I love it. And I couldn't agree more. I mean, if you think the election of 2020 was free and fair and you stood up for the rule of law during that time, you are under the big tent. That is just how we see it. So, Charlie and Ed, what a thrill to get to see you and meet you and work with you. We're just so honored and grateful to both of you. Go check out Ed's book, and Charlie, go check out Charlie's Substack. And everyone, thanks so much for coming under the tent tonight, and we'll see you really soon. Good night, everyone.